So yes, as I said, welcome to the second in the MARSOCSI seminar series. Just a quick note, if you aren't speaking, please can you turn your microphone off, just so that we don't get any noises interrupting the speaker as we go along. If you do have any questions at all, please feel free to post them in the chat box while the seminar is on, and then we'll also have some time for questions at the end as well. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Carla, who's going to be talking to us today about some of the work she's been doing in her PhD. Carla's background is in marine science and evaluation. She does do transdisciplinary work across the domains of marine and coastal policy and management and the practice of citizen science. Carla's professional experiences have allowed her to work extensively with government, community and non-profit groups in Australia and Canada to co-create policies and programs that achieve social and ecological outcomes. She is currently undertaking a PhD, as I said, through the Faculty of Arts and Social Science at the University of Technology, Sydney, exploring the complex human-environment connections in fisheries systems. And her interdisciplinary research focuses on management effectiveness through drivers of change, the influence of legitimacy, and alternate management strategies. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Carla.
Thanks, Karen. Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in today. It's great to see so much interest in this topic. And I'm really keen to share what I've learned about this topic with you guys today. I also want to thank the Marine Social Science Network Australia for the opportunity to share that. It's great that this webinar series is available to learn from each other. So my name is Carla Sbrocchi, and as Karen mentioned, my background's in marine science, but I've also worked over the last decade in marine and coastal management and policy. So really, I'm coming at a PhD from having worked in this area or working in marine management for some time. And I think that's colored how I think about some of these really deep and rich concepts that have come from the social science traditions. I've observed that marine managers often really struggle with trying to make those concepts operational in their work, even though they know that they're valid. We know that management is all about people. So how do we translate those concepts into something that's operational for management? And so today I wanted to share just a little bit about how I've started to think about that, or how I've been thinking about that in my PhD. So we go. So just a little outline of what we're going to look at today. First, I'm going to give you an overview of how I read legitimacy and show you how I've approached it in a management context. And then I'll use some examples from my field studies in Chile with the southern king crab fishery to illustrate how legitimacy can be incorporated into some typical tools of the trade. Two of the ones that I'm going to look at today are a management costs framework that looks at the financial and social trade-offs. And the second one is looking at management strategy preferences and how we elicit preferences on management strategies, and how we look at legitimacy in that particular context. Then we'll have some time for questions and discussion. So I hope that I'll be able to get some feedback on my approach today from you, and we'll be able to have some good discussion about that. So before we talk about legitimacy, I think it's helpful to review the typical framework that fishery managers work within. Of course, this is a vertical representation, and we all know that these things aren't quite as cut and dried and neat and tidy as that. There's a lot of overlap in these different areas, but it sort of sets out roughly the types of things that fishery managers have to consider. So at the top, we have these overarching drivers of legislation or international obligations. We have approaches like ecological sustainable development or ecosystem-based fisheries management. So those are all the things sort of at the top level that influence how we start to implement our fishery management. Harvest strategies are becoming more of a prevalent tool in fisheries management, and they usually encompass an analytic phase that compares different outcomes of different management strategies. So there might be some different ways of managing a fishery. how do we compare one strategy versus another strategy? So this analytic phase kind of goes through some different scenarios and assesses them against each other. And eventually you deliberate those outcomes and decide on a particular strategy, which then is adopted into fisheries implementation. So legitimacy is a much discussed concept in social sciences. And it's often used in reference to legality, or sort of the modern interpretation kind of leans towards legality. So it means that a management institution might be considered legitimate if it adheres to certain principles and practices and standards or legislation or these approaches that we've talked about in these overarching drivers. And if it abides by those rules and structures, we might see that as being legitimate. But we also see a lot in fisheries management literature that managers have to build legitimacy, or we need to do things that will enable legitimacy or grant legitimacy. So if this was just a case of making sure that you're in line with these overarching drivers, you would be legitimate. We wouldn't have these kinds of conversations in fisheries management. So I think the way I'm sort of observing this is that some our fisheries management might be what might be considered paper legitimacy. On paper, they have all the right components like sustainable development statements. They might have co-management arrangements. They might have customary or small-scale access rights, but they're actually marred by inadequate implementation. So this is what reduces the perceptions of acceptability. So clearly legitimacy interacts with all of these different levels that you're seeing on the screen. But I'm going to focus specifically on these bottom two, about fishery management and harvest strategy. So I draw my understanding of legitimacy from a couple different traditions. One is institutional perspectives, and one is interactive governance. And I did that to try and reduce this really powerful political concept of legitimacy into something more workable in a management context. So we need to ask a couple questions. So legitimacy is of what? Adger suggests that legitimacy is the rightness of a course of action. So it's something to do with rightness or acceptability. But Suchman expands that a little bit more into exactly what that might mean. So it's a perception or assumption that the actions of a certain entity are desirable, proper, or appropriate. So it's really focusing on these actions. So the actions are what we're looking at of legitimacy, and who is assessing the legitimacy. So in this particular context, I'm looking at those who are being governed, those as part of the fishery system, as opposed to an external social acceptability. So in this specific context, I'm looking at those people who are within the management system, the fishers, the post-harvest actors, the researchers, the managers. But of course, you have to gauge that against something. So we're gauging legitimacy against some kind of performance. It's the way people construct these evaluations is against their own system of norms and beliefs, or the constructed set of norms and beliefs that they jointly have, which is what Suchman was pointing to at the top. Essentially, the way that they come up with this sort of evaluation is they're evaluating on whether it's efficient or effective or equitable or legitimate, and those things essentially maybe theoretically are separate, but in practice they're actually all together. You can't separate all of those things. So if these are the traditions that legitimacy is coming from, or way of reading it, what does that mean on the ground for a manager? So trying to distill all of that into something functional. So I think if we try and think about managers and where legitimacy becomes a problem, is there's a difference between what managers say they will do, or what management is expected to do in terms of legislated obligations, and the difference between what they actually do. So on the left, we've got this difference between what they say they do and what they're going to do. But that, of course, has to be mediated by something. So there is a difference between those two. but it's mediated by what level of governability can actually be achieved. So what can you actually do in this particular system is constrained by some of the characteristics of the system. It's also constrained by the capacity and the resources of the managers. So the baseline and the top boundary have to come in a little bit from what we say we do and what we think we can do because of these particular constraints. So what that means is if we move over, if we kind of reevaluate Suchman's definition of legitimacy and we incorporate some of these other ideas about capacity, we can come up with a more refined definition that I think is a bit more workable. So given the capacity and the characteristics of the system and the management system, are the actions of the management body perceived to be desirable, proper, and appropriate by its constituents? So really focusing on this desirability, proper, and appropriate, and looking at some examples from fisheries to see how those legitimacy, how that comes to light. So legitimacy is rarely discussed in a static situation. So if something has been around for a long time, we don't seem to view them as having legitimacy deficits, but of course it really comes to light when there's some kind of change happening, when you have a fisheries reform process, which of course is probably predicated on some kind of legitimacy deficit. So I wanted to explicitly explore legitimacy, how does an explicit consideration of legitimacy inform a fisheries management transition? So when you're in this transition phase, if we specifically look at legitimacy in that transition, how does that help us to better make that transition? So I'm going to introduce you to one of my field studies here that we're going to look at through some of these examples. So in 2018, I did some field work in the southern king crab fishery in Chile. So it's right at the very bottom of South America. As you notice from this map on the left, that it's characterized by fjords, channels, islands. It's quite a large area and very small population dispersed across the regions. The region's called the Magallanes. It's adjoining, of course, Argentina, shares a border in multiple locations, and of course adjacent to Antarctica. So highly productive and sparsely populated. The southern king crab fishery is highly productive and very high value fishery, so primarily export market. It had an $80 million US dollar export value last year. And it's very important for this particular region. So the Magallanes region contributes nearly 100% of the king crab export. So it's mainly coming from this particular region. So it's, of course, very relevant for them. It's also culturally relevant. They have a lot of festivals that king crab feature in. So it's emblematic to the region. It's iconic, but of course also provides a source of livelihood and a main employment industry. But small-scale fisheries is very well entrenched also in Chile. It's a very important part of their culture and traditions, small-scale fishing. Over the years, small-scale fishing has become more industrialized. So although it's still entrenched in fisheries legislation, that small-scale fishing is protected and has specific rights of access, the fishers themselves have become more industrialized and more commercialized. So it looks less and less like your mom and pop single boat operator and becoming more like an industrial commercial fishery. But they're still within that small-scale fishing fleet and characterized by that fleet. This high value of the king crab and a low control situation given the geographic distribution here has created a situation of overexploitation. There's both illegal and legal fishers exploiting, and it resulted in 2013 a new fisheries legislation and a closure of the registry in 2014. So there's no new entrants into this king crab fishery as of 2014. In 2016, a management committee was established, and specifically they were tasked with developing a management plan that would rebuilding program or protection measures that would establish some biological reference points, but at the same time maintain exclusive rights for artisanal fishing that they currently have now. So in mid-2018, I went to investigate this particular fishery. I conducted interviews with a range of fishery participants, fishers, post-harvest, non-government researchers, and government managers as well, and in order to understand their views on the fishery management problems and to potentially find some solutions to the over-harvesting problem. So that's context for the examples I wanted to talk to you about. So I first want to look at the first tool of the trade is a management cost framework. So this is a fairly typical type of thing that managers might use to look at their different management activities. So the 4 rows are just some general areas of management activity. So we managers have to acquire information and distribute information about the stock. There's decision-making processes that need to be taken into account, some of the operational costs of the fishers, as well as the monitoring and enforcement activities. So each one of these particular domains has both financial costs associated with it and social costs. So the financial costs that are up here on the screen, these are things we are fairly familiar with, or we have a fairly good understanding of some of the financial costs associated with management. And actually Dowling has produced a database that has some example costs for pretty much all of these things. So we've got a good handle on financial costs, but it's the social costs that we're not as familiar with, or we don't seem to have the same kind of a database for what types of costs might occur and how much resourcing it would be required to intervene in some of those things. So I specifically wanted to look at what that might look like if you did explicitly consider legitimacy as part of your social costs in this particular framework, and use that to try and understand where you might need to target your investment as a manager. So I'm going to look at, although I did this across all of these 4 areas as part of my thesis, I'm just going to look at 2 in particular today during our presentation. So first I'm going to have a look at the decision-making context. So in the middle column, there's a couple things that are articulated here in terms of what is the current situation for their decision-making costs. In this southern king crab fishery in Chile, there's a high number of decision-making nodes. So there's quite a few different organizations that are involved in making decisions. There's the management committee itself. There's the joint government managers. There's the control agency and the administration agency. There's a multitude of other research organizations, and there's several layers of government that all have to tick off on a particular decision. So there's quite a few different nodes. Of course, the more nodes you have, the more time it takes to make a decision, and therefore that increases the cost to the manager. Excuse me. The second item is consensus. So of course, consensus is an important property of co-management, but with consensus, it takes longer to come to a decision, or if you don't have a shared understanding, this takes a longer time and more resources need to be dedicated to that. The third one is a property where the members of the committee have to self-fund in order to attend meetings. The premise of that, or the rationale, is that by being self-funded, it's a commitment by fishers and the other representatives to attend meetings. It helps them to take their responsibilities seriously, that they will attend the meetings and they will come to decisions. So that's the context in which decisions are made. Are these decisions seen as desirable, proper, and acceptable? The properties that we just talked about, the consensus and representative participation, self-funding, these are all desirable. The participants consider them desirable from the perspective of a shared norm between the governors and the governed, but the implementation has not been viewed as acceptable. And that's due to concerns about the level of representativeness of the group, the leadership and the agency of the committee, and the commitment to the decision-making process by the authorities. So for example, in the southern king crab fishery, it's a 5-month fishing season, and the remaining 7 months is closed. So in the 5-month season, fishers primarily spend time at sea, which means that committee meetings can only occur in the other 7 months. Take off a month for Christmas holidays and you're left with 6 months for committee meetings. Members are distributed across the region and they come to the regional center for meetings bi-monthly. And as I mentioned, they must self-fund, but they're coming from across this whole region. Some of them, it's a 50-hour ferry ride away from the center. So this comes at a substantial personal investment. Someone with means could participate, but the infrequent meetings reduce the ability to reach these shared norms. So it's really difficult for them in this 6-month period to develop the shared norms that's required in order to make decisions. So this produces a really high transaction cost. If we don't have the shared norms and the trust and the reciprocity, it takes a lot longer to come to a decision, which increases the cost. So desirability is high, credibility of the approach is high in light of the constraints, but acceptability is low due to the commitment and resourcing of the endeavor. So 4 years on from when the management committee was first instated, but limited determinations have been made. So here we can see that the facets of co-management and consensus should garner legitimacy, but they don't. So building a shared understanding will require more investment in working together to build trust and social capital, which will enable a more efficient working environment. So that's a bit of an example how that framework can look at those two different types of costs. I'll give you one more example just to flesh that out a little bit. When we look at monitoring costs, it has to weigh up the size of the area with the method of surveillance. So in this particular case, enforcement is undertaken by a government agency, but they are poorly resourced to adequately administer and enforce the seasonal size rules. And they're basically limited to land-based surveillance. They don't have any boats, so there's no enforcement out at sea. With the 2013 fisheries legislation, there was new rules instated for satellite surveillance, so this could now be instated. But it's only for the largest vessels within the fleet. So 15 meters up to 18 meters, they must have satellite surveillance installed. And that's because there are certain restriction or access rules limiting these larger vessels into certain parts of the coast, and they're only for the smaller vessels. So the surveillance is really just to keep the big vessels out of these particular areas. However, there's a bit of a loophole there. So if only the largest vessels are being surveyed, there's this opportunity for the smaller vessels to go and fish those areas that are specified for them. They catch and then they transact with the larger ships under the table. So these are both registered and unregistered fishers that undertake this kind of activity. So there's no shared norm around monitoring between the governors and the governed. So the governed don't think that the current practices are desirable. They don't want this illegal, unregistered fishing to occur because it diminishes the overall catch that's available to the registered fishers, but also it puts pressure on the resource, and they're understanding that this is a significant pressure. They want to see the illegal fishing constrained. So the approach is not credible. The approach that with this surveillance only for the larger vessels doesn't seem credible to the governed. They think that it should apply to everybody. So if some are going to have surveillance, everybody should have surveillance just to help increase the transparency. So the practices of monitoring are not acceptable or not considered to be acceptable, as there's nothing which controls the illegal fishing or which assesses the compliance with the existing regulations. So currently there's no way of assessing compliance apart from at the port. They don't know who's catching what and where it's coming from or what method was used. So they meant to use traps, but did somebody use a diver or a net or something to capture? So the recommendation here is to involve the fishers in the design of the monitoring and enforcement practices. So they actually have some really great ideas. It would be good to get them on board with making suggestions for how we could, under the current constraints of resourcing, find a way of designing better monitoring programs that are both cost efficient and effective in reducing illegality and the compliance problems. So I'm not going to go through all of those other ones on the screen, but just to indicate that I have done that for each one. So my framework allows the manager to assess these trade-offs between the financial costs of the interventions and the legitimacy concerns. And that way you can better understand where investment might need to be targeted or how you might design your consultation practices better. In the case of the southern king crab fishery, there's little shared norm around the management. And the current policy is seen as a de facto mechanism for solving an overfishing problem. So basically the way that people see it is that because management is not investing in shared norms, because management is not investing in increasing information or supporting decision-making practices, they see that as a de facto decision to allow the larger operators to continue to operate, which pushes up the smaller operators, which then solves to some degree the overfishing problem by limiting the amount of effort across the fishery. So they see a non-decision as being a decision, if you get my drift. But this actually doesn't address the illegality problems. It certainly doesn't address the access to small-scale fishing in its full intent. So the governors may be meeting their obligations of the legislation in their own estimation, but the perceptions of those who are being governed is that the model is not desirable or appropriate, and to them that's illegitimate. So participatory decision-making is at the moment seen as kind of a lip service with little legitimacy. Deliberation processes are unclear and they've resulted in policy paralysis. So a commitment to the participatory participation practices, maybe by devolving some of the decisions. So if you looked at all the different types of decisions could be made here in terms of information, monitoring, that sort of thing. You could possibly devolve some of those decisions across those areas rather than giving the management committee every single one of those things to consider at their meeting, and that would spread out the types of decisions that would have to be made and also involve people at other stages. And that would increase legitimacy and then reduce the transaction costs and hopefully overcome some of the inertia that's been happening. So the second tool I wanted to talk to you about revolves around the design stages of the management plan itself, so the harvest strategy. So the harvest strategy design revolves around preferences usually, so asking people about, or asking fishers or other people about preferences for management systems, and then using those preferences to help design the best system that might be applied. So things like changing gear or changing seasons or restricting seasons or kind of licensing arrangements or shares or restricting areas, or those are kind of all the decisions that seem to come up when asking people about their preferences. So these harvest strategies will assess preferences and then they evaluate them against how they achieve certain objectives. So how does legitimacy interact with this process? Well, the typical process used by fisheries scientists, it's participatory, so it might meet a theoretical legitimacy claim there that we're involving people in that. And it usually involves consensus in selecting the final strategy. And we nominate objectives across the environmental, social, and economic realm. So those are all things that meet kind of that initial legitimacy claim about whether that's appropriate. But this process, when you do it, it results in lists and lists of objectives. There's just a couple up here as an example that I've pulled out of some of the literature, but it can result in dozens of nominated objectives from people. So at some point you have to narrow that down. to come up with a smaller sort of workable set of objectives that you're going to use for the fishery. And this is where legitimacy really, things are hitting the fan here. So first and foremost is who has nominated the objectives, how are they rationalized to a smaller list, how are they worded, and who benefits from them. These are all kind of issues that come up when we're starting to look at how to make this list workable. So I'm going to show you some examples of what that might mean here. So what I did with my case study in Chile, so I went about a similar process that's typically undertaken by asking people to rank order. So basically order some different examples of management systems in order of preference to them. So these are, remember, they're managers, they're fishers, they're post-harvest, they're government. There's a range of different type of people. And there's a range of just sort of hypothetical management systems that I proposed, things like quota, certification programs like MSC, TERFs, some kind of spatial or restriction or rotation. So just kind of some generic things, and ask them to rank those in order of their preference. So what happens is you sometimes can get a little bit of a differentiation between the favored and the least favored. But often what happens is you get a big mishmash in the middle of things that are more or less the same to people, with maybe small levels of difference. So even if you separate this out into what did the managers think and what did the fishers think, you still end up with a similar mishmash or mix of performance of these different management strategies. So that's a real limitation here, is that you don't really get a clear winner and a loser. Usually there's a mix of them, and some might be better for different types of purposes than others. It's also really difficult for people to differentiate ranks between things. When you ask them how much better is 1 than 2, or how much better is 2 than 5, it's really difficult for them to answer that question. So often the ranks that they give are a bit of a guess, or they're just frustrated and they just put something down. That was my observation anyways. So even when you do separate it out, as I mentioned before, about what is the mix, what types of management systems might give you what types of benefits, there's a real mix in there too. So some systems, people think that they give you a better biological benefit, some ones give you better economic benefits. But again, the difference between 1 and 2 is pretty small. It's really hard for people to do that. Now, I actually just used this exercise as a bit of a foil. This was not my main purpose in getting their preferences. I used this as a foil to actually find out what are the reasons behind them giving these particular answers. So although I asked them their rank, I asked them why they gave those certain preferences. And they actually gave some really interesting answers in terms of the themes that came out from that process were that they perceived certain things to perform against an internal set of objectives. So they weren't evaluating them against the specified legislative objectives. They were working on a different set of objectives, and I wanted to find out more about those. So I was really looking for their mental models of the system and what they thought would be effective. So what I found is that really what they were looking for in a management system was something that would provide a diversity of livelihood strategies. So remember that the fishery is closed for 7 months of the year. They need to still have some kind of income stream. So they're looking for something else that will allow them to have opportunities either to invest in the fishery that will carry them through, or some other kind of strategy that will accommodate that 5-month fishing season. Also, they're really looking for equal opportunities for all fishers across the fleet. So remember I said that although they're all artisanal fishers within this category of registry, some are much more industrialized than others. And a lot of the subsidies and things are being directed towards the larger operators. So they're becoming more efficient, and those subsidies are not open to the smaller fishers. They really want something that's more consistent and equal opportunity for all of the small-scale fishers. And the last thing that was really important to them was considering more ecosystem and climate interactions. And they thought that was important as a management strategy. So what does that mean for developing harvest strategies? It's really important to think about how legitimate are the objectives that you use in the ranking exercises. Are they desirable, proper, and appropriate? So in this particular case, in my case, they weren't. They were not desirable, proper, and acceptable. So by asking the reasons, we can develop a more legitimate set of objectives that align with all of the things, the legislative requirements, the capacity of the institution, and the desires and the norms of the governed. So this list in front of you, this is just something I put together based on some of the reasons that they gave me. This is indicative only. This is not a final set, or this hasn't gone through their management committee, but just gives you an idea of how you might change the way that you look at objectives and what sorts of objectives might be seen as more legitimate as opposed to just a generic set. So asking these reasons reveals the true objectives of the group. And that's what can form the shared understanding of what's at stake. So I think that's really important to consider. So let's pull this all together. So I showed two examples of some typical management tools that aim to achieve legitimacy, but often this experience shows us that we have flawed operational translations of what those structures should look. So we want to be able to match what we do and what we say, but there's often a problem with the implementation. So we need to try and figure out what makes the fishery governable. And we have to go beyond the blunt instrument of preferences. We need to look at the reasons behind those preferences. We need to look at the different sectors of the industry and tailor our management strategies to fit the goals that they are revealing. So what this means is if you are going down the path of using ranking exercises for objectives, if you go down that path, ask about the reasons to help develop a better set of objectives. If you have the capacity and the ability, try and co-design the management objectives with people by asking about their reasons. So, of course, we also need to test those management systems for the outcomes and unintended consequences, which is the next step that goes along with this process. That is in my PhD, but I'm not discussing it today just for the sake of time. So you can use those to develop a better set of objectives and then test them through management strategy evaluation to see how they perform. So I aim today to show how a fairly opaque concept like legitimacy could be rendered operational. And I've used some standard tools and techniques that are used by managers. As we can see, the benefits of doing this helps us to understand the reasons behind the preferences. By understanding the full range of management costs, both the financial and the social, it shows us where there are gaps in our alignment between management systems and our goals. And it makes transparent where efficiency, effectiveness, and equity, which are the co-outcomes of legitimacy, where they're impacted as well. So overall, my thesis finds that an explicit consideration of legitimacy in fisheries management suggests that we should have a redirection of effort to understand these costs and benefits across the whole financial and social dimension, so that what we do matches what we say. So thanks so much for listening in today. I know that was a huge concept to try and unpack. I hope that I helped kind of push us a little bit further in how we can unpack that. I just want to recognize some support, financial support for my PhD from these sources here. And of course, I couldn't do this without my supervisory support from Kate and Beth, Laura, and Bill, and from support from the University of Technology and the Center for Marine Socioecology too. So I'd love to hear a little bit from you on how you as listeners are thinking about this concept, what you think of this approach. I'd love some feedback on that approach. So I might turn it over to Karen now for some questions, period.
Thank you very much, Carla, for a super interesting talk on something that I think probably all of us will agree is often very difficult, a concept that's very difficult to think through and how it relates to particularly how it works in practice. So yeah, thank you for that. And what I'd love to do now is to throw the floor open to any questions. If you want to ask a question, perhaps you could put your hand up if everybody knows how to do that. Yeah, otherwise feel free to jump in and speak if nobody else is speaking. So do we have any questions? Doug.
Great talk, thank you, Carla. My question is a little bit about unknowable elements in your framework, and I guess I'm thinking about the inevitable influence from political outsiders or rent seekers from within seeking influence, particularly for themselves. That kind of system where your structure is very pointed at the ideal, and I've yet to see an MSE that deals with a minister being influenced by a big player and creating a subsidy change. And this seems to me to go to the heart of the legitimacy debate, because that stuff always happens. And I'm particularly interested if you had those sorts of discussions with your stakeholders and how they felt about it. Because in a system where there's big players and little guys and all manner of investments, the capacity to cast influence into the political system or whatever is, going to be a real wild card in my guess. And so I'm really interested in that.
Yeah, for sure. Great question. I think there's a whole bunch of stuff that I couldn't share today about how those types of things that you're talking about fit into here as well. So of course there are, like you said, there's these big drivers that are coming from outside of the people to be governed, I suppose. But that's part of that whole system of understanding who are the ones to be governed and what space and context they're working in. Of course, in Chile, you do have these sorts of situations. You have very strong vocal people that, as you do in probably everywhere around the world, you have these political machinations that are happening behind the scenes. And I think that's what the benefit of this sort of approach can help to tease some of those things out by, I conducted interviews, so you're really getting in depth with people on their understandings of the system and who are the players and what are some of those things, maybe less obvious things that are going on in the background, but are certainly big influences. So this structure that I presented today is really kind of that broad brush, but it does allow for you to understand some of those inner workings that are happening on the edges. So I couldn't go into those all today, but look, of course there are elements of surprise that you can't see. There's always going to be surprise, but I think sometimes you can see unrest in certain players in that system, and that maybe this kind of approach can help you understand where the unrest is, where are the gaps in people's minds about what is legitimate and what is not. And that might just help you to alert you to a problem that you could try and address in some way.
Thanks, Carla. And we have another question in the chat, which is, what if the management strategy is legitimate, but doesn't translate into economic benefit for all stakeholders? Do we then consider this as a trade-off?
Yeah, absolutely, it's a trade-off. So that's what management strategy evaluation tries to do, is to look at what are the trade-offs amongst different groups of people, amongst the different costs involved. So you might have efficiencies in some locations and less efficiency there. But I think where this concept of acceptable, desirable, and proper can help is sometimes if there's enough legitimacy in the organization itself and people have views of legitimacy that the organization can approach the process well, they can sometimes accept something that doesn't benefit them if they see it being a just process or an equitable process, even if it doesn't immediately benefit them, let's say economically. So I think there's some trade-offs that can happen there even within legitimacy, that someone, if they see the process as just and fair, they can accept that it's a legitimate decision even if it doesn't benefit them individually. So there are trade-offs in that system there that kind of buffer those legitimacy impacts.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from the floor? While everyone else is thinking of questions to ask you, I might throw a few of my own at you and take advantage of my role as facilitator. One of the things I was particularly interested in, Carla, was your choice of using a case study. And I was wondering if you had just one case study, and if so, how you saw that as being transferable to other locations, or if you actually had a number of different case studies, and if so, if you were finding similarities in terms of legitimacy across those case studies.
I am using 2 case studies as part of my PhD. The other one is the New South Wales rock lobster fishery. And I chose these 2 fisheries for a couple of reasons. One is New South Wales rock lobster has been fairly well established in legislation for quite a long time. They have a quota management system that's been operating roughly since the early 2000s, and it's seen to be being very effective in recovering an overexploited resource and also returning economic benefits back to the fishers. So that's seen as quite a well-established, legitimate program, I guess you could say. And comparing that to Chile, which is very emerging in a state of transition, the management plan is not yet established, and so what are some comparisons that we can see from these different types of systems, also being crustacean fisheries, and different types of political systems as well, I think. So I wanted to do something similar, some things different, just to give an idea of how we can look at legitimacy in these different contexts. So of course the same types of issues come up. So that's been interesting to see what are the similarities there. But of course, there's very different types of legitimacy issues in these different cases for a range of reasons. So just exploring some of those things in New South Wales is the co-management systems are very well established. They've got good practices and programs. Legitimacy issues in New South Wales are more around the different sector arrangements. So with recreational fishing and so the commercial, recreational, and Indigenous fishing have to share the sector, which is not the same in Chile. Chile doesn't have to share the sector. So there's different issues there in terms of sharing arrangements that, I found interesting to explore.
Absolutely. It'd be lovely to hear more about that other case study at some point as well, I think. We have a couple more questions in the chat. We have one from Nick that says, can the political aspect that Doug mentioned best be addressed at the wider level that encompasses specific management processes? For example, a separation of management agencies, ministerial offices, etc.
I'm not sure if I completely understand the question. I could have a stab, or I don't know if Nick's still there, if Nick wants to clarify. The political aspects.
So sorry, Nick, are you there?
Yeah. I suppose I was thinking about the same thing that Doug mentioned, and I'm not particularly familiar with all of the political aspects of these processes. But I do know that historically one tactic that's been used to stop, overt political influence on decision-making processes is for management agencies to be slightly separated from political processes and, a clear sort of policy framework set up so that, technical processes have specific objectives they have to meet, and a minister can't, for example, walk into a decision-making process having, been a change in government or a particular influential stakeholder knocking on their door and saying, oh, we have to change all this sort of stuff. So I'm not necessarily suggesting that is a solution, but I'm just wondering whether some of these political issues are difficult in the context of technical processes and management processes like you're talking about. I wonder whether there's some influence at that higher level, the level above what you were specifically talking about that might be able to help there, or just your reflections on that upper level and the political aspect of that upper level. I hope that clarified things. It might not have, but anyway.
Yeah, no, thanks, Nick. I'll see if I answer your question the way you asked it. So I suppose, yes, of course, there's all these political lobbying activities, or there's lots of things that happen outside of the technical space that occur at all the different levels of this, like that framework that I presented, at all those different levels. I think where you can try and accommodate some of that politicalness in this sort of technical framework is looking at what are those shared understandings, or where the gaps in those shared understandings of legitimacy through this process of looking at the objectives. So what are people's preferences? Where are those gaps that different people have, the different understandings that people have of the system and how they think management should happen, and seeing the diversity of those views. So in this sense, we're not necessarily looking for consensus, that will cover up some of those. Consensus seems to cover up those issues that end up going to the minister, right? So if you have consensus, often the minister won't have to be involved. People feel the need to go to the minister when their view is not incorporated in this sort of consensus process. So by looking across the different types of views, you're at least alerted to the different views and understandings of the system and where people might have problems with legitimacy. In terms of your management and the capacity of the management institution, we don't always have the ability to address those at our technical level, but it alerts you to the fact that there might be a gap and a problem that you might need to address through other avenues as a manager, through other sorts of structures or processes that may be outside of your technical domain. But I think it at least gives you an idea of where there could be a problem. I suppose of an example in New South Wales just a couple years ago of a marine park was being established or was looking to be planned. All sorts of planning instruments happened around where this marine park would be. It got announced, and then the minister shot it down and basically shot the thing in the water because of a lobby interest from recreational fishers. And they said they were not being considered as part of that. So that's, of course, the management, the marine parks process didn't adequately consider the recreational fishing interests in their communications, I suppose, or in some of the way that they designed. And so the lobby felt the need to go to the minister in order to get their point across. So I guess if you look at the sort of framework that I'm proposing, it might give you just an advance warning that maybe there's something there that needs to be considered at a different level. I don't know if that answered Nick, sorry.
No, that's great. Thanks, Carla.
Thanks, Carla. And we're kind of getting to the end of our time. We do have another comment in the chat box, so I think we'll take that as the final one for today, if that's okay. And it's a comment from Kate, and Kate says it strikes her that asking further questions around preferences, such as the reasons behind preferences, is a really good way to get deeper, more complex and context-specific answers to preferences about management options. And that, as you pointed out, Carla, simply asking what preferences are in a closed way gives very unsatisfactory answers. That richer, more qualitative answers about preferences seem really much more useful as a basis for working towards the design of objectives. And Kate's question is, would you, Carla, or anyone else in the group like to comment on this?
I'd like to hear comments from others. Thank you, Kate.
I've got a quick one. It's Doug here. This reminds me of a long ago survey that our recreational fishing managers did in New South Wales, where they asked a question, do you like this size limit change or whatever it was? And they were looking for a binary yes or no answer, when in fact people were, if they were asked why they liked it or didn't like it, you learned a whole bunch of extra stuff. No, I don't like that. It doesn't go far enough. As opposed to, no, I don't like that. It goes too far. And that's exactly what you're saying here. And it's really important because the reasons people or think they want things and put voice to that are often actually about other things and not the thing they're talking about. You know, why I don't like quota has maybe a whole bunch to do with not actually quota management, but some other stuff, you know, as an example. Yeah. And so I really support that idea of trying to dig in. It's just devilishly hard for public servants to get into it.
Carla, would you like to respond to that?
Oh, no, I agree. And I think that's often the component that I mentioned or alluded to is the capacity element. So what capacity does the management institution have to ask these sorts of questions? Which I think why we often go to these ranking sort of exercises, because it's a lot quicker. We can tick off and say, yep, we consulted people, we got their ideas of things. It is very hard to actually organize a way of asking these deeper questions and then summarizing them and pulling them together. But I suppose that's why I see a really important link between social science researchers and how we can support managers in that, and bringing these sorts of issues, or by becoming more aware that this is an important technique to try and incorporate into management, and trying to support the managers together in doing that. I think that will be a really useful partnership.
Absolutely, and I think finishing on the importance of marine social science is a really good one for this seminar series. So I would just like to say thank you so much for such an interesting talk and discussion today, Carla, and thank you everybody else for joining in and asking questions. It's been super interesting. And we will be holding another seminar in about 2 months' time. I'll be advertising that very soon, so please do come and join us for that one as well. Thank you again to everybody.
Thanks, Karen. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.